Hi, it's John Vu, and this lesson is on swinging a rhythm. So when we swing a rhythm, what we're doing is we're alternately altering the duration of two consecutive notes in the same subdivision. Okay, so it sounds pretty complicated, but let me explain it. Okay, so we need at least two notes in the subdivision, therefore we can't swing quarter notes because there's only one note in that subdivision. Okay, so the simplest rhythm we can swing is eighth notes because there's two notes in that subdivision. Okay, so with eighth notes, we've got a note on the downbeat and we've got a note on the and, okay, the midpoint of the beat. So they're two evenly spaced notes per beat. So eighth notes on the pad against this pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4, sound like this, okay? So the duration of each of those notes is the same, okay? They both last half a beat. So if we wanted to swing that rhythm, what we need to do is we need to alter the duration of each note, okay? So they're not the same length. So what we're going to do first of all is we're going to extend the first note so it's longer, and we're going to shorten the second note so it's shorter. Okay, and that would be a swung rhythm. That would be swung eighth notes. So for instance, if I still played the first note on the downbeat, but instead of holding it to the and, the midpoint, I held it further to 2/3 of the way through the beat, okay, which is further than halfway through the beat. And then the next note I played on the upbeat, I played on that 2/3 of the way through the beat. Okay, so I played it at that point, two-thirds of the way through the beat. And it lasted for the rest of the beat, so it only lasted a third of the beat. So the first note has extended from half a beat to 2/3 of a beat, and the second note has shortened from half a beat to 1/3 of a beat. Okay, so the rhythm would sound like this. This would be swung eighth notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so they're still eighth notes, but they're swung eighth notes. Okay, so I'm alternately altering the duration of each note, okay, and they're consecutive notes, so they're right next to each other in the same subdivision. So the first note is longer, and then the next note is shorter. So the durations are changing. I'm altering the durations alternately. So the first one's longer, second one's shorter. Okay, so listening to the two rhythms back to back. So I'm going to play one bar of normal eighth notes, which we call straight eighth notes. Okay, so when we hear that term, that just means play them normally, which is the default way. Okay, so just evenly spaced, two notes per beat, one on the downbeat, one on the and, the midpoint of the beat. So I'll play that for the first bar, and in the second bar, I'm going to swing the rhythm. I'm going to play the first note on the downbeat, and I'm going to play the second note 2/3 of the way through the beat, and it's going to be a shorter note. Okay, so it's only going to last for a third of a beat, that second note. The first note is also extended, obviously, to 2/3 of the beat. So it sounds like this, back to back. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that was one bar of straight eighth notes and one bar of swung eighth notes. Now there's different magnitudes of swing, and it all depends on the ratio of the duration of the two notes. Okay, so in that first example of swung eighth notes, the first note was 2/3 of a beat in length, and the second note was 1/3 of a beat in length. Okay, so the first note was twice as long as the second note. Okay, so 2/3 is twice as big as 1/3. So the ratio of the duration of the two notes was 2 to 1. Okay, first note was twice as long as the second note. So now we're going to try another version of swung eighth notes. The first note is going to play the downbeat again, and it's going to last 3/4 of a beat. Okay, so we're extending the first note from its usual length of half a beat to 3/4 of a beat. And the second note, we're going to change the duration from half a beat, so its normal duration, to 1/4 of a beat. Okay, so we're shortening the second note again. So the first note is 3/4 of a beat. The second note is 1/4 of a beat. Okay, so that sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and listening to it back to back with straight eighth notes, so 1 bar of straight eighth notes into 1 bar of this version of swung eighth notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that was different to the first example of swung eighth notes in that the first note was even longer. Okay, so in this case, it hit the downbeat and it lasted 3/4 of a beat. Okay, so in the first example of swung eighth notes, the first note lasted 2/3 of a beat. So in this case, it's 3/4 of a beat in length, which is even longer. Okay, so we're extending that first note by even more. Okay, to 3/4 of the way through the beat. And then the second note is shorter than the first example. Because the first note is even longer, there's less room for the second note. Okay, so there's less of the beat left over. So that second note is 1/4 of a beat. So in the first example of swung eighth notes, the second note was 1/3 of a beat, which is obviously bigger than 1/4. Okay, so there's slight differences in the two versions of swung eighth notes. So in this case, we hit the downbeat, it lasted 3/4 of a beat, the second note lasted 1/4 of a beat. So the ratio of this second example is 3 to 1. The first note is 3 times longer than the second note. So the first note is 3/4 of a beat, the second note is 1/4 of a beat. Okay, so there's two different magnitudes of swing there. The first rhythm, very common. So the first example of swung eighth notes, very common, playing a 2 to 1 ratio. And this one is also common, and this is a 3 to 1 ratio, so it's a heavier swing. So now we're going to play the three rhythms back to back. So the first rhythm we're going to play is straight eighth notes. So they have a ratio of 1 to 1. So both notes of the subdivision are the same length. They're both half a beat in length. Then the second rhythm we're going to play is swung eighth notes at a ratio of 2 to 1. So the first note is going to be twice as long as the second note. So we hit the downbeat, that lasts 2/3 of a beat. The second note comes in 2/3 of the way through the beat and it lasts 1/3 of a beat. A ratio of 2 to 1. And then the third rhythm we're going to play is the swung eighth notes at a ratio of 3 to 1. So the first note on the downbeat lasts 3/4 of a beat. The second note on the upbeat lasts 1/4 of a beat. Okay, so those three rhythms back to back sound like this, and we'll go through it twice. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how we swing a rhythm. It's when we alternately alter the duration of two consecutive notes in the same subdivision.